The bright orange cable running across Daniel Carter's lawn had annoyed the HOA for weeks. But no one expected what would happen the day it disappeared, because when that cable was cut, an entire county suddenly lost its internet. Daniel had moved to Pine Valley hoping for quiet suburban life. Clean streets, friendly neighbors, and a peaceful routine working from home as a network engineer. The only unusual thing about his house was the thick orange fiber cable that ran from a small utility box near the street into his garage. It wasn't pretty. Daniel knew that, but it was temporary. The cable had been installed by the county's broadband project while they upgraded infrastructure across the region. Technicians had explained that the bright color made it easy to identify and prevented anyone from accidentally damaging it. Daniel had even placed a small warning sign beside it: "County fiber line, do not touch." Most neighbors ignored it, but one person did not. Across the street lived Carol Whitmore, a devoted HOA board member who believed the neighborhood should look absolutely perfect. To her, the cable wasn't just an eyesore, it was unacceptable. For weeks she complained about it during HOA meetings, insisting the bright orange line ruined the appearance of Pine Valley. Daniel had explained it was temporary, he had explained it was important, but Carol had already decided something. And on a quiet Tuesday morning, while Daniel was working inside his home office, someone stepped onto his lawn with a pair of garden cutters. Within seconds, the orange cable snapped. Carol walked away satisfied. What she didn't realize was that the cable she had just cut wasn't only connected to Daniel's house. At first, Daniel didn't notice anything unusual. He was reviewing network logs on his computer when his screen suddenly froze. The internet connection dropped without warning. That was strange. Daniel refreshed the connection once, then twice. Still nothing. Outside, the neighborhood looked normal. Birds chirped, cars passed quietly, and sunlight reflected off neatly trimmed lawns. Then Daniel checked his phone, no signal there either. Moments later his doorbell rang. It was his neighbor Mark, holding his phone with a confused expression. "Hey, is your internet down too?" Daniel stepped outside and immediately saw the problem. The orange cable across his lawn had been cut clean in two. For a moment he simply stared at it, then his stomach sank, because Daniel knew something most people in Pine Valley didn't. That cable wasn't just supplying his home. The temporary fiber line had been routed through his property while technicians upgraded the main distribution hub for the county. Daniel grabbed his phone again and opened a network monitoring app. His eyes widened. The outage map was expanding rapidly. Neighborhood. Town. Surrounding areas, thousands of connections were going offline one after another. By the time Daniel looked back up from the screen, another neighbor was already walking down the street asking the same question: "Is everyone's internet down?" Across the road, Carol Whitmore stood on her porch holding her tablet, frowning at the screen. Daniel quietly glanced at the severed cable, and suddenly he understood something. The entire county was about to discover exactly what that ugly orange cable had been doing. Within an hour, Pine Valley felt strangely disconnected from the modern world. Phones struggled to load messages. Smart devices stopped responding. Even the coffee shop down the street couldn't process card payments. Residents gathered outside, comparing notes and refreshing their devices over and over. Still nothing worked. Daniel remained calm, but his mind was already calculating the damage. He walked toward the cable and crouched beside the clean cut. Whoever had done it hadn't hesitated. It was deliberate. Across the street, Carol stepped down from her porch and approached him. "Did they finally remove that cable?" she asked casually. Daniel slowly looked up. "Someone removed it," he said. Carol smiled slightly. "Well, the neighborhood looks much better now." Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he pulled out his phone again and opened the outage dashboard. The red warning alerts were spreading like wildfire. Entire sections of the county had lost connectivity. Hospitals had backup networks, but small businesses were already reporting issues. Schools couldn't access online systems. Offices were shutting down early, and then, in the distance, a white utility truck turned onto the street. Behind it came another, then a third. Technicians stepped out quickly, scanning the area with concerned expressions. One of them walked straight toward the orange cable. He knelt down beside it, then slowly stood up again. His voice carried across the quiet street. "Who cut the main fiber line?" Carol's smile faded, because for the first time, she realized the situation might be much bigger than she had imagined, and the explanation Daniel was about to give would change the entire conversation. The technicians worked quickly, inspecting the damaged cable while speaking urgently into their radios. Neighbors watched from their driveways, confused by the sudden activity. One technician turned to Daniel. "Is this where the temporary county fiber was routed?" Daniel nodded. Yes. They ran it through my property while upgrading the main distribution line. The technician sighed heavily. That explains everything. Carol stepped forward nervously. What exactly does that mean? The technician glanced at the severed cable. This line wasn't just feeding one house, he said calmly. It was temporarily carrying traffic for several regional nodes. Daniel could see the moment Carol's expression changed. The technician continued, when this cable was cut, the entire system lost its connection path. Carol blinked. You mean the neighborhood? The technician shook his head. No. Much bigger than that. He pulled out a tablet and showed a map of the network outage. Red warning markers filled the screen across multiple towns. This cable was supporting connections across most of the county while the permanent infrastructure was being upgraded. The street fell silent. Neighbors stared at the map in disbelief. Carol's face slowly drained of color. Wait. Are you saying, yes, the technician replied, cutting this cable disconnected thousands of people. A second technician began preparing equipment to repair the damage. But the process would take time. Meanwhile, residents around Pine Valley were still refreshing their phones and wondering why the internet had suddenly vanished. Daniel remained quiet, but the technicians had one more question. They looked directly at him and asked something that made the entire street tense. Do you know who cut it? The question hung in the air like a sudden storm cloud. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced down at the clean cut in the bright orange cable. The edges were smooth, clearly sliced by sharp garden cutters. Then he slowly looked across the street. Carol Whitmore stood perfectly still. The technicians waited patiently. Earlier this morning, Daniel said carefully, the cable was intact. One of the technicians nodded, and now, Daniel gestured toward the lawn. Now it isn't. Several neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Everyone knew Carol had been complaining about the cable for weeks. Carol cleared her throat quickly. Well, that line was extremely ugly, she said defensively. It was ruining the appearance of the neighborhood. The technician raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, that cable was part of an active infrastructure project. Carol shifted uncomfortably. I thought it was temporary clutter, she muttered. Daniel remained calm. He wasn't angry. He was simply watching the situation unfold, because the technicians were now explaining something very important. Repairing a fiber trunk line wasn't as simple as reconnecting two wires. It required specialized equipment, precise alignment, and hours of careful work, and until the repair was finished, the county would remain offline. Businesses, schools, offices, and thousands of homes. All because of one small decision made on a quiet suburban lawn. Carol slowly looked around at the neighbors staring at her. For the first time since Daniel moved to Pine Valley, she seemed completely unsure of what to say, but the biggest consequence of that cut cable was still coming, because someone at the county network office had already begun tracing the outage, and soon, they would arrive with questions of their own. By late afternoon, another vehicle arrived in Pine Valley. This one carried the county infrastructure supervisor. He stepped out, reviewed the damage, and listened carefully while the technicians explained what had happened. Then he turned toward the street. Who owns this property? He asked. Daniel raised his hand calmly. The supervisor nodded respectfully. Thank you for allowing the temporary routing during construction. Then his eyes moved toward the severed cable. This outage has affected thousands of connections across the county. Carol looked increasingly uncomfortable as neighbors watched the conversation. The supervisor continued. We placed warning markers along this line because it's active infrastructure. Daniel pointed gently toward the small sign near the lawn, right there. The supervisor walked over and read it silently. County fiber line, do not touch. He sighed quietly, then he turned back toward the street. I assume someone ignored the warning. No one spoke, but Carol's expression had already answered the question. The technicians continued repairing the line as daylight slowly faded. Hours later, the final connection snapped back into place. Across Pine Valley, phones lit up again. Wi-Fi signals returned. Businesses reopened their systems. The county was finally back online, but the story of how the outage happened had already spread through the neighborhood. And the quiet street where Carol once enforced HOA rules so confidently felt very different now, because everyone had learned something that day. Even the smallest cable can carry enormous responsibility, and cutting it without understanding its purpose can create consequences far beyond one lawn. The following week, Pine Valley held its monthly HOA meeting, but this time, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Residents whispered quietly about the incident that had briefly disconnected the entire county from the internet. Carol Whitmore sat near the back of the room, unusually silent. When the meeting began, the HOA president made a new announcement. From now on, he said carefully, no HOA member or resident may alter, remove, or interfere with any marked utility infrastructure. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. Daniel sat quietly in the corner, listening without saying much. He hadn't argued, he hadn't demanded punishment, the situation had spoken for itself. Outside the meeting hall, the bright orange cable had already been replaced and secured properly by the county technicians. It still wasn't beautiful, but now everyone understood why it was there. Sometimes the things that look inconvenient or unattractive serve a much larger purpose behind the scenes, and sometimes, the biggest lessons come from the smallest actions. Daniel returned home that evening, opened his laptop, and watched the network systems stabilize once again. The internet flowed quietly through Pine Valley like nothing had ever happened. But the neighborhood would never forget the day the ugly orange cable disappeared, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you love the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.